I never believed in ghost stories until that summer. It was July, and the relentless heat wave had turned the air into something heavy and almost tangible. My best friends, Sam and Lily, convinced me to join them on a trip to Blue Ash Lake, a secluded spot known for its crystal-clear water and eerie legends. We were tired of the mundane activities in our suburban town, and a little adventure sounded like the perfect escape. Blue Ash Lake was a 2-hour drive from where we lived, nestled deep within the hills, surrounded by dense pine forests. The journey itself was uneventful, save for Sam's relentless attempts to outsing the radio. We reached the lake by mid-afternoon, the sun casting golden streaks across the rippling water. The place was picturesque but unnervingly quiet. We expected to see other visitors, perhaps families or couples enjoying a picnic. Instead, it felt abandoned. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. A faint unease crept over me, but I quickly brushed it off. "See?" Lily exclaimed, pointing at the pristine water. "It's perfect. No crowds, no noise. Just us." Sam threw his backpack on the ground. I called dibs on the first swim. We spent the first hour swimming and basking in the sun. The water was cold but refreshing, and for a while, it felt like we had stumbled upon a hidden paradise. Sam brought out his portable speaker, and soon, our laughter and music echoed across the lake. It wasn't until sunset that things started to feel off. The golden light softened into hues of pink and orange, and the air became cooler. We decided to set up camp near the lake's edge. Sam lit a small fire while Lily unpacked sandwiches and chips. I took out my camera to capture the breathtaking view. "Hey, guys," I said, peering through the lens. "Come look at this." Sam and Lily joined me, staring at the image on the camera's screen. It was a photo of the lake, but there was something odd. A figure standing at the edge of the water. A woman, dressed in white, with her back to us. "What the hell?" Sam muttered. "There's no one here but us." We scanned the shoreline, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. The photo gave me chills. "Maybe it's a trick of the light," Lily suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. The fire crackled behind us as the shadows of the trees grew longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, sleep came uneasily. The three of us huddled in the single tent we brought, the fire now reduced to embers. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of faint whispering. At first, I thought it was Sam or Lily, but they were both sound asleep. I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The moon illuminated the lake in an ethereal glow, and that's when I saw her, the same figure from the photo. She was standing in the water, her dress flowing around her like smoke. "Sam, Lily," I hissed, shaking them awake. "Get up." By the time they scrambled to the tent's entrance, the figure was gone. Sam shone his flashlight across the lake, revealing nothing but ripples. "You're imagining things," Sam said, but he didn't sound convinced. We spent the rest of the night awake, the silence punctuated only by the occasional rustling of leaves. The next morning, we decided to leave. As we packed up, I noticed something disturbing. Wet footprints leading from the water to our campsite, stopping just outside the tent. The footprints chilled us to the core. Sam, always the brave one, tried to laugh it off. "Maybe we were too close to the water last night," he said, though his voice wavered. "Could have been an animal." But the footprints were distinctly human, and they stopped abruptly at the entrance to our tent. No returning tracks. No explanation. Lily, visibly shaken, insisted we leave immediately. I couldn't blame her. I packed up my belongings faster than I ever had before. We trudged back to the car in uneasy silence, the towering pines around us casting long, ominous shadows. But when we reached the car, the unease turned to dread. "Why are the doors open?" Sam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The car doors on both sides hung ajar. Sam had locked them before we left. I was sure of it. The contents of the glove compartment were scattered across the seats. The keys, which Sam swore he had left under the driver's seat in a lockbox, were lying on the dashboard. None of us had a rational explanation. We climbed in hastily, locking the doors behind us. Sam started the car, and we sped down the winding road without a word. As we drove, the forest seemed to close in around us, the tall trees forming a canopy that blocked out the morning light. The air inside the car was thick with tension. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, following us. Then, it happened. The car jolted violently, as if we had hit something. Sam slammed on the brakes, and we all lurched forward. "What was that?" Lily cried. "I don't know," Sam said, fumbling to unbuckle his seatbelt. "I'll check." "No." Lily grabbed his arm. "Don't get out." But Sam shook her off and stepped out. I stayed frozen in my seat, staring out at the road ahead. It was empty, but something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Sam crouched near the front bumper, inspecting it with his flashlight. "There's nothing here," he called out. "No animal, no." He stopped mid-sentence. His flashlight beam wavered, and then he stood up slowly. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sam didn't answer. He backed away from the car, his flashlight now pointed toward the trees. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him. "There's someone out there," he said. Panic surged through me. I turned to Lily, whose face had gone pale. "Sam, get back in the car," I shouted. Before he could move, a figure stepped out from the trees. It was the woman from the lake. Her dress, now caked with mud, clung to her gaunt frame. Her face was obscured by a tangle of wet hair. She raised an arm, pointing directly at Sam. He stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. The beam spun wildly across the ground, illuminating her pale, lifeless eyes. "Get in the car," Lily screamed. Sam bolted, diving into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut. He fumbled to put the car in gear, his hands trembling. The woman didn't move, but her gaze followed us as we sped away. For miles, none of us spoke. The road seemed endless, the oppressive silence inside the car mirroring the eerie quiet of the forest. When we finally reached the main highway, it felt like we had escaped a nightmare. But the nightmare wasn't over. Later that evening, back in the safety of my room, I decided to look at the photos I had taken. I needed proof, something tangible to make sense of what we had experienced. Scrolling through the pictures, my heart stopped. In every photo of the lake, she was there. The woman in white, standing in the background, always facing the water. But it was the last photo that made my blood run cold. It was taken near our tent, at dusk. The firelight cast long shadows, and there, between the trees, she stood, staring directly at the camera. I deleted the photos in a panic, but I knew it wouldn't erase what had happened. That night, I dreamed of her. She stood at the edge of the lake, whispering my name. Even now, I hear her sometimes, late at night, in the silence. It was supposed to be the perfect summer getaway. Every year, my extended family gathered at my uncle's cabin in Vermont. Tucked away in the woods, it was a sprawling old place with creaky floors, a wraparound porch, and a private dock overlooking a glassy lake. It was rustic, charming, and isolated. The ideal spot to disconnect and unwind. That summer, my cousin Kate and I decided to arrive a week earlier than the rest of the family. Kate had just finished her first year of college, and I had graduated high school, so we thought of it as a celebratory trip. We spent the first 2 days lounging by the water, hiking trails, and swapping stories late into the night. On the third night, though, things took a strange turn. It started with the lights. The cabin ran on solar power supplemented by a generator, and everything worked fine during the day. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights began to flicker. At first, it was subtle, just a quick blink that we laughed off. But as the night wore on, the flickering became more erratic. "Do you think the generator's acting up?" Kate asked as she lit a candle. "Maybe," I replied. "Or it's the solar panels. We've been using the AC all day." We tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the cabin's age. But then, as we sat in the living room playing cards, we heard the first sound. It was a faint tapping, like fingertips drumming against glass. Kate froze, her card halfway to the table. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my ears straining. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was coming from the window behind us. Slowly, we turned to look. Outside, The night was pitch black, and the porch light barely illuminated the area beyond the window. There was nothing there. Kate got up and peeked through the curtains. "Probably just a branch," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. The tapping stopped, but an uneasy silence settled over the cabin. That night, I struggled to sleep. The room felt unnaturally cold, and every creak of the old wooden floorboards set my nerves on edge. I was on the verge of drifting off when I heard it again. The tapping. This time, it was at my bedroom window. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of something on the other side. "A hand? Kate?" I whispered. No answer. Summoning my courage, I crept toward the window and pulled the curtain aside. There was nothing there, just the dark forest and the faint glow of moonlight. The next morning, I told Kate about what had happened. To my surprise, her face went pale. "It wasn't just you," she said. "I heard it too. At my window." We decided to check the perimeter of the cabin after breakfast. The morning sunlight made everything feel less sinister, and for a while, I almost convinced myself it was all in my head. But then we found the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the dirt just below Kate's window. "Bare feet. Do you think someone's been watching us?" Kate asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say. The idea that someone had been outside while we slept made my skin crawl. We spent the rest of the day inside, double-checking the locks and covering the windows with blankets. By the time night fell, we were on edge, jumping at every little sound. That's when the lights went out completely. At first, we thought it was the generator. Kate grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the kitchen to check it, while I stayed in the living room, holding a candle. Then I heard her scream. I ran toward her, the candle flickering wildly in my trembling hands. What is it?" I asked. Kate stood frozen at the back door, the flashlight trembling in her grip. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. "I locked it," she said, her voice shaking. "I swear I locked it." And then we heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch above us. The sound of the footsteps above us was deliberate, each creak of the old wood stretching the seconds into eternity. Kate's flashlight trembled in her grip, the beam darting across the dark corners of the room. "Upstairs," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "Someone's upstairs." Kate nodded, her face pale and glistening with sweat. We backed away from the open door, silently agreeing to stay together. The soft thuds continued above, pacing slowly back and forth. "What do we do?" she whispered. I scanned the room for anything that could be used as a weapon and grabbed the poker from the fireplace. Kate armed herself with a heavy iron skillet from the kitchen. We huddled by the staircase, listening as the steps paused directly above us. "Who's there?" Kate called out, her voice cracking. No answer. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of my heart. Suddenly, the footsteps resumed, this time heading toward the stairs. Each creak and groan of the old wood was amplified in the stillness. I raised the poker, my hands shaking. The flashlight beam flickered as Kate pointed it toward the staircase. And then the footsteps stopped. The air was thick with tension as we waited, every second feeling like an eternity. Then, without warning, the front door slammed shut, followed by the distinct sound of heavy boots running across the porch. "Go!" Kate shouted. We bolted for the door, adrenaline propelling us forward. The night outside was a blur of shadows and moonlight as we sprinted toward the car. Kate fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling too much to unlock the doors. "Hurry," I urged, glancing over my shoulder. I saw nothing but darkness, yet the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Finally, the locks clicked, and we scrambled into the car. Kate started the engine, and we peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying behind us. As we sped down the dirt road, the cabin disappeared into the trees, but the sense of dread lingered. "Do you think they're following us?" Kate asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. I looked out the back window, half expecting to see headlights or a shadowy figure in the rearview mirror. "I don't know," I admitted. We drove in silence until we reached the nearest town, where we pulled into a gas station. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Should we call the police? Kate asked. What are we going to tell them? That someone walked on our porch and opened a door? I said, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. Kate nodded reluctantly, and we decided to spend the night at a motel. But the story doesn't end there. The next day, after much deliberation, we decided to return to the cabin to gather our belongings. The thought of leaving without knowing the truth gnawed at us, and in the daylight, it didn't seem as terrifying. When we arrived, the cabin was eerily quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the porch. It was as if the events of the previous night had been a fever dream. But then Kate found it. A single piece of paper, folded neatly and placed on the kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Scrawled in jagged, almost childlike handwriting were the words, "You're not welcome here." We left without packing. It's been years since that summer, but the memory still haunts me. We've told the story to family and friends, but no one believes us. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined it all, if our paranoia turned a series of coincidences into something sinister. But then I remember the note and the sound of those footsteps above us. And I know something or someone was in that cabin with us. If you like these stories, please support us by liking and subscribing. It helps me find more creepy stories for you. The summer of 2017 was the hottest I could remember. The kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and turned even the lightest breeze into a slap of warm air. My family and I lived in a small, rural town in southern Kansas, surrounded by endless fields of wheat and corn. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep. That summer, a boy named Will Taylor went missing. Will was 15, the same age as me. He lived 2 streets over and was known for his love of the outdoors. When he didn't come home one evening, his parents assumed he had stayed out late exploring the woods by the river, as he often did. But when he didn't show up the next morning, they called the police. For a week, the town searched for him. Volunteers combed through the woods, fields, and abandoned barns, while police dragged the river. Flyers with Will's smiling face were plastered on every telephone pole and storefront window. But as the days stretched into weeks, hope began to wane. And then, during the second week of the search, I made a discovery. I was out with my best friend, Jake. We weren't supposed to be near the woods. Our parents had forbidden it after Will's disappearance, but curiosity got the better of us. Armed with flashlights and a vague sense of bravery, we ventured into the dense thicket one evening, just before sunset. The air was thick with humidity, and the buzz of cicadas was almost deafening. We followed a narrow dirt path that wound through the trees, our sneakers crunching against the dry leaves. "Do you think we'll find anything?" Jake asked, his voice betraying his nerves. "I don't know," I admitted. "But if Will's out here, someone has to find him." We walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker with each passing minute. Just as we were about to turn back, I saw it, a flash of red among the trees. "Jake, look," I said, pointing ahead. We approached cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the dim light. It was a red baseball cap, torn and dirty, lying at the base of an old oak tree. "Do you think it's his?" Jake asked, picking it up. "Maybe," I said, though my gut told me it was. Will always wore a red cap. That's when I noticed something else. A faint trail of broken branches and trampled grass leading deeper into the woods. Without thinking, I started to follow it. "Hey, wait," Jake called, hurrying after me. The trail led us to a small clearing. In the center stood an old hunting cabin, its weathered wood bleached gray by the sun. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. "This is a bad idea," Jake said, but I was already moving toward the cabin. The air inside was stifling, the smell of mildew and rot overpowering. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I scanned the room. It was mostly empty, save for a broken chair and a pile of old newspapers in one corner. And then I saw it, a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden beneath a tattered rug. "Jake, over here," I whispered. We stared at the trapdoor, neither of us daring to open it. What if he's down there? Jake said. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Grabbing the edge of the trapdoor, I pulled it open. The stench hit us immediately, a sickly, metallic odor that made my stomach churn. Below was a narrow wooden staircase, descending into darkness. Do we go down? Jake asked, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, a sound froze us in place. A faint creak, like a floorboard shifting. Someone's here, I whispered. Jake grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with fear. We need to go. Now. But before we could move, a shadow fell across the doorway. Jake and I froze, our breaths caught in our throats. The shadow outside the doorway didn't move, but its presence was enough to paralyze us. My flashlight shook in my hand as I aimed it toward the open trapdoor. Stay quiet, I whispered, though my voice barely carried over the pounding of my heart. The shadow shifted, and the faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves echoed through the cabin. Someone, or something, was circling the building. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the trapdoor. We can't just stay here, he hissed. I nodded, forcing myself to think through the panic. The cabin had no back door, and the boarded windows offered no escape. Our only options were to face whoever was outside, or go down into the darkness below. As if reading my thoughts, Jake whispered, "We're not going down there." But the sound of the footsteps grew louder, and the shadow returned to the doorway. This time, I could make out the silhouette of a tall figure, backlit by the faint glow of the setting sun. "Down," I said, my voice trembling. Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. Together, we descended into the trapdoor, the wooden stairs creaking under our weight. The stench grew stronger, and I fought the urge to gag. We reached the bottom and found ourselves in a small, dimly lit cellar. The walls were lined with shelves holding rusted tools, old jars, and other unrecognizable items. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly. But it wasn't the cellar itself that made my blood run cold. It was what lay in the corner, a small, makeshift bed with a thin, filthy mattress. And on the mattress, a pile of clothes that looked eerily familiar. "That's Will's," Jake whispered, pointing to a torn shirt I'd seen him wear before. Before we could process what we were seeing, the trapdoor slammed shut above us, plunging us into near darkness. Jake let out a muffled scream, and I clamped a hand over his mouth. "Quiet," I whispered. We listened, straining to hear over the sound of our own breathing. The floorboards above us creaked as the footsteps resumed, this time slower, more deliberate. "They know we're here," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. The footsteps stopped directly above the trapdoor. A moment later, the faint scrape of metal against wood sent a chill down my spine. "They're locking it," I realized. Jake bolted toward the stairs, pounding on the trapdoor. "Hey, let us out," he shouted. "Stop," I hissed, pulling him back. "You're just going to make it worse." "Worse than being trapped down here," he shot back, his face pale with fear. I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the shelves, where we crouched in the shadows. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out. Then, the light bulb overhead flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness. "Do you hear that?" Jake whispered. At first, I thought he meant the footsteps above us, but then I realized he was talking about something else. A faint, shuffling sound coming from deeper in the cellar. "There's someone down here," he said. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling as I switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on a shape in the far corner of the room. It was a figure, slumped against the wall. "Will?" I whispered, moving closer. The boy was gaunt, his face pale and hollow. His red cap lay crumpled beside him. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and when his eyes opened, they were filled with terror. "Help me," he croaked. Before we could respond, the trapdoor above us creaked open again. Harsh light spilled into the cellar, and a deep voice called out, "What are you doing down there?" The figure above us stepped into view, a man with a weathered face, holding a shotgun. His eyes narrowed as he descended the stairs, the weapon trained on us. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice cold. "Please," I said, holding my hands up. We were just looking for our friend. He's hurt. The man's gaze shifted to Will, and something in his expression darkened. He's not your friend anymore, he said. Jake and I exchanged a terrified glance, and in that moment, I knew we had to act fast. Before the man could react, Jake grabbed a jar from the shelf and hurled it at him. The glass shattered, and the man stumbled back, momentarily blinded. "Run!" I shouted. We scrambled up the stairs, dragging Will with us. The man cursed and fired a shot, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Splinters of wood rained down on us as we burst out of the trapdoor and into the night. We ran without looking back, Will stumbling between us. The wood seemed endless, but eventually, we broke through the trees and onto the dirt road where Jake's car was parked. As we sped away, I glanced back at the dark forest, half expecting to see the man in the rearview mirror. We called the police as soon as we reached town, and they found the cabin the next day. But the man was gone, and so was any evidence of what had happened. Will never spoke about what he endured in that cellar. And sometimes, late at night, I think about the man's words, "He's not your friend anymore." I still don't know what he meant, and maybe I don't want to. Summers in our small town always meant one thing: the traveling carnival. It would roll in during the first week of August, setting up on the outskirts of town in a vast, empty field. By the second day, the once barren lot transformed into a vibrant patchwork of colorful tints, flashing lights, and the tantalizing aroma of fried dough. My friends and I lived for carnival season. This year, however, something about it felt different. For starters, the carnival arrived without the usual fanfare. No posters went up ahead of time, no announcements were made. It simply appeared overnight, its lights piercing the darkness like a beacon. And the carnival workers, the carnies, weren't the usual crew we recognized from years past. These people were strangers, quiet, pale, and almost too eager to blend into the shadows. But none of that stopped us from going. That Friday evening, I met up with my friends, Emma, Lucas, and Danny, at the main gate. The sun was setting, casting a fiery glow over the carnival as we handed over our tickets. A strange man in a faded top hat took them without a word, his smile unsettlingly wide. "Creepy," Emma whispered as we walked in. Lucas shrugged. "It's all part of the vibe. Let's hit the rides." We spent the first hour laughing and screaming on the rickety attractions. The Ferris wheel creaked with every revolution, and the spinning teacups nearly made Danny lose his dinner. By the time we got to the midway games, the sky was dark, and the carnival lights cast an eerie glow over everything. "Step right up," a voice called, snapping my attention to a nearby booth. A man with a thin mustache and a crooked bow tie beckoned us over. "Win yourself a prize." The game was simple: knock down 3 bottles with a single ball. But as I watched, I noticed something odd. The bottles didn't move. No matter how hard people threw, they remained firmly in place. "It's rigged," Danny said, shaking his head. Emma nudged him. "They're all rigged." That's the fun. Still, there was something about the way the carny smiled as people walked away empty-handed. It wasn't just amusement, it was satisfaction. "Let's keep moving," I said, suddenly uneasy. The next booth we passed was even stranger. It advertised the Mirror of Truth, with a banner that read, "See yourself as you truly are." Emma was intrigued and stepped inside before any of us could stop her. The rest of us hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances before following. The tent was dark and smelled faintly of damp earth. A single mirror stood in the center, framed by flickering candles. Emma stepped up to it, her reflection glowing faintly in the dim light. "Doesn't seem that special," she said, her tone dismissive. But as we watched, her reflection began to change. Her face contorted, aging rapidly until it resembled an ancient, skeletal version of herself. Emma screamed and stumbled back, and the mirror returned to normal. "What the hell was that?" Lucas demanded, grabbing her arm. A voice from the shadows answered, soft and raspy, "The truth." We spun around, but the tent was empty. "Let's get out of here," Emma whispered, her face pale. As we stepped back into the open air, the carnival felt different. The music was warped, the lights dimmer, and the laughter of the crowd seemed distant and wrong. "I think we should go," I said, my voice unsteady. But Danny pointed toward the far end of the carnival, where a massive black and gold tent loomed. A banner above the entrance read, "The Maze of Midnight." "One last thing," Danny said, grinning. "Come on, it'll be fun." "I don't know," Emma started, but Danny was already heading toward it. Lucas followed, and I sighed, knowing I couldn't let them go in alone. The inside of the tent was a labyrinth of black walls and mirrors, lit only by faint, flickering lights. The air was cold, and the silence was unnerving. "Stick together," I said, though my voice wavered. We moved slowly, the maze twisting and turning in impossible ways. The mirrors distorted our reflections, stretching and bending them into grotesque shapes. "This is weird," Lucas said, his voice echoing unnaturally. A moment later, I realized Emma was no longer with us. "Emma?" I called, panic rising. No answer. We doubled back, searching every corner, but the maze seemed to shift with every step. Danny vanished next, his voice fading into the distance before we could reach him. It was just Lucas and me now, and the cold was unbearable. "We have to get out of here," Lucas said, his breath visible in the frigid air. I nodded, but every path led us deeper into the maze. And then, just as I thought we were utterly lost, a new reflection appeared in the mirror ahead. A figure in a long coat and top hat, its face hidden in shadow. The reflection raised its hand and pointed directly at us. The figure's hand seemed to stretch impossibly long, its reflection rippling in the warped glass. "Run," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. We bolted, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the maze's twisting walls. Every turn felt wrong, leading us back to distorted mirrors and dead ends. The air grew colder, and with each step, the sound of something following us grew louder. Shuffling footsteps, heavy and deliberate. "Over here," Lucas shouted, pulling me toward a narrow corridor. We skidded to a halt at the end of the passage, confronted by a full-length mirror. Our reflections stared back at us, but something was off. The glass rippled, and the images began to change. In my reflection, my face twisted into something monstrous. Eyes hollow, mouth gaping unnaturally wide. Lucas's reflection did the same, his skin peeling away to reveal raw muscle and bone. "This isn't real," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But then, the reflections moved independently, stepping toward the glass. "Go," I yelled, yanking Lucas away. We turned down another corridor, only to find Emma standing at the far end. Relief flooded me, and I ran toward her. "Emma!" I shouted. She didn't respond. Her back was to us, her shoulders stiff. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Her head jerked unnaturally to the side, as though hearing something we couldn't. "Emma?" Lucas said, his voice shaking. She turned slowly. Her face was blank, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth moved silently, forming words we couldn't hear. "What's wrong with her?" Lucas whispered, backing away. Before I could respond, she lunged at us, her movements jerky and inhuman. I grabbed Lucas, pulling him out of the way as she slammed into the wall with a sickening thud. "We need to get out of here," I shouted. We ran blindly, the maze seeming to close in around us. The air grew thick, the walls pressing closer. Every path felt the same, and the mirrors distorted not just our reflections, but reality itself. And then, we found Danny. He was slumped against a wall, his eyes wide with terror. His lips moved weakly, whispering something over and over. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "They're coming," he rasped. "They're coming for all of us." Before we could react, a shadow fell over us. I looked up to see the figure from the mirror, the man in the top hat, looming above us. His face was obscured, but his eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "Welcome to the end," he said, his voice a low rumble. Lucas screamed, and the man reached out, his hand impossibly large, his fingers curling like claws. I grabbed Danny, pulling him to his feet, and the three of us stumbled away. The walls of the maze seemed to pulse, closing in on us. The shuffling footsteps were everywhere now, accompanied by faint whispers. "This way," Lucas shouted, pointing to a faint light ahead. We sprinted toward it, bursting through the maze's exit and into the cool night air. The carnival was gone. The field was empty, save for a few scraps of fabric fluttering in the wind. No tents, no lights, no music, just the endless stretch of grass under the starlit sky. What just happened?" Danny asked, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The next morning, we told our parents everything, but no one believed us. The sheriff's department searched the field and found nothing. The carnival, it seemed, had vanished without a trace. Weeks later, I had a nightmare about the maze. In it, I was back inside, staring at my distorted reflection. The figure in the top had appeared again, but this time, he spoke directly to me. "We're always watching," he said, "and we'll see you again." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. That summer was the last time the carnival came to town. The last summer before college felt like the end of an era. My friends and I spent those long, lazy days trying to soak up as much of our small town as possible before we scattered across the country. We had a tradition of camping out at Sandy Creek, a secluded spot at the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods and a lazy river. It was the perfect place for bonfires, ghost stories, and late-night confessions. That August, we decided to make our final trip to Sandy Creek one to remember. There were 5 of us: me, Ellie, Rob, Mason, and Claire. We loaded up Mason's old truck with sleeping bags, snacks, and enough firewood to last the night. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the river. "Let's make this epic," Rob said, grabbing the cooler. We set up our camp near the riverbank, the sound of rushing water blending with the chirping of crickets. Mason built the fire, and soon we were sitting in a circle, the flames crackling as the sky turned from orange to deep blue. "All right," Ellie said, pulling out a flashlight. "Who's got a good story?" Rob grinned. "I've got one. It's about the witch of Sandy Creek." Claire groaned. "Oh, come on. Not that one again." "Let him tell it," Mason said, throwing another log onto the fire. Rob leaned in, his face illuminated by the flickering light. "They say she was a woman who lived in these woods 100 years ago. People thought she was a healer, but when crops started failing and animals went missing, they blamed her. They dragged her down to the river and drowned her. But before she died, she cursed this place, swearing revenge on anyone who stayed here after dark." The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. "Legend says, if you hear her voice calling your name, you're doomed. She'll lead you into the woods, and you'll never come back." "That's such BS, Claire said, rolling her eyes. "We've camped here a dozen times, and nothing's happened." "Maybe she likes you," Rob said with a smirk. "Or maybe you're just bad at ghost stories," Ellie added, laughing. We spent the next few hours roasting marshmallows, laughing, and reminiscing. By midnight, the fire had burned low, and the conversation had turned quiet. That's when we heard it. A faint voice, carried on the breeze. "Did you hear that?" Mason asked, his face suddenly serious. We all went silent, straining to listen. The voice came again, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was saying my name. "Very funny, Rob," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Rob shook his head. "That wasn't me." "It's probably someone messing with us," Ellie said, though her voice trembled. We grabbed flashlights and shone them into the woods, but the dense underbrush swallowed the beams. "We should check it out," Mason said, standing up. "No way," Claire said. "Let's just stay by the fire." But Mason had already started walking toward the trees. Rob and I exchanged a glance before following him. The woods were unnervingly quiet, the usual hum of insects and rustling leaves eerily absent. The voice came again, closer this time. "Mason, stop," I said. "This isn't funny." He didn't answer. Instead, he kept walking, his flashlight bobbing as he moved deeper into the forest. "Seriously, dude," Rob said. "Come back." When Mason finally stopped, we saw why. In the clearing ahead was an old, crumbling well, surrounded by moss and overgrown weeds. Mason approached it cautiously, peering inside. "It's empty," he said, his voice echoing slightly. And then, from deep within the well, the voice spoke again. It wasn't calling my name anymore. It was calling Mason's. Mason stumbled back from the well, his flashlight shaking in his hand. That wasn't real," he muttered, his voice trembling. "It couldn't be." Rob grabbed his arm. "We need to go. Now." But before we could turn back, the voice came again, soft, melodic, and unmistakably from the well. "Mason, come closer." The words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just the sound. It was the way the voice seemed to pull at something deep inside, like an invisible thread tying Mason to the well. "Mason, don't," I said, stepping between him and the crumbling stones. But his expression had changed. His eyes were wide, almost glassy, as if he wasn't really seeing us. "It knows my name," he whispered, taking a step forward. Rob and I grabbed him, pulling him away. His resistance was weak, but his gaze never left the well. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees swayed, though there was no wind, and the darkness felt alive. "We're leaving," I said firmly, dragging Mason with us. When we returned to the campsite, Ellie and Claire were waiting by the fire, their faces pale. "What happened?" Ellie asked. "The well," Mason mumbled, slumping onto a log. "The what?" Claire asked, looking between us. "There's something out there," Rob said. "Something wrong." As he spoke, the fire dimmed, the flames sputtering as if starved of air. We piled on more wood, but it didn't help. And then the voice returned, louder this time, echoing through the woods. "Mason, come back." We froze, staring at each other in disbelief. "Who's doing this?" Claire demanded, her voice shaking. "No one," I said. "There's no one out here but us." As if in response, the voice changed. "Rob, Ellie, Claire, come closer." It was calling all our names now, each word dripping with a sinister sweetness. "I'm not staying here," Claire said, grabbing her backpack. "We're leaving." We didn't argue. Scrambling to gather our things, we doused the fire and headed for Mason's truck. The voice followed us, growing louder, its tone shifting from melodic to mocking. "Hurry! You can't escape!" We broke into a run, the forest around us seeming to shift and twist. What had been a straight path now felt endless, the trees looming taller and denser with every step. "It's right behind us," Ellie screamed, glancing over her shoulder. I didn't dare look back. All I could hear was the voice, now a cacophony of whispers and laughter. When we finally reached the truck, we piled in, Mason fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. But the voice didn't stop. It echoed in our ears, even as we left Sandy Creek behind. Back in town, we went to the police. Mason told them everything. The voice, the well, the way it seemed to know us. But they dismissed it as a prank or a case of overactive imaginations. In the days that followed, Mason began to change. He grew quiet, withdrawn. He stopped answering our calls and texts, and when I went to his house, his parents said he wouldn't leave his room. And then, a week later, Mason disappeared. His truck was found parked near Sandy Creek, but there was no sign of him. The police searched the area for days, but came up empty. Rob, Ellie, Claire, and I tried to make sense of it, but the truth was too terrible to admit. Mason had gone back. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself thinking about the well, the voice, the way it had pulled at Mason like a magnet. And then, in the silence of my room, I heard it, soft, melodic, and impossibly close. "Come closer,"